Hello, and thank you for joining in to listen to the MIID webinar series hosted by the Ohio Department of Developmental Disabilities. My name is Beth Boyle, the Northwest Regional Liaison with the Ohio Department of Developmental Disabilities and the Division of Policy and Strategic Direction. Today we'll be talking with Jean Stuntz from Dynamic Pathways, Steve Fetsko, President of the Prader-Willi Association, Grace Todd, and Lisa Youngblood. The group will be talking about proactive ways to engage a person, prevent and or reduce the need for restrictive measures, and how to provide quality care for a person living with Prader-Willi Syndrome. I will now turn it over to Jean.
Thank you, Beth. We're going to get started, and we actually are going to start with Grace Todd. And what we've done is Grace and Lisa are both here. They both have Prader-Willi Syndrome, and they are going to start our webinar off with sharing with us about the syndrome and how it feels to actually have it and how to live with it. So I'm going to ask some questions of both the ladies, and we're going to start with Grace. So Grace, first question. Everybody has a story. Can you share with us a little bit about yours?
My name is Grace, and okay, I live at home with my parents, and my second home is the barn. I love horses.
What else is going on in your life that you want to share with us?
And I have a dog.
Is your dog important to you?
He's not right now.
That's okay. Is your dog important to you?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. Well, can you tell us a little bit about what it's like living with Prader-Willi Syndrome?
Food is, the way we handle food is very different, and balance is hard, and also being in public with a lot of people.
That's true. Okay. And when we talked before, you talked a little bit about
T5.
Okay, go ahead.
T5 is a place where I learned how to control my behaviors, but also how some things that were making my life and some of the things that I did was part of why I did some of those things.
So is anxiety a part of that?
Anxiety is a huge part of that.
Okay, can you talk about what it feels like when you get anxious?
I start to tense up, and also sometimes I'll lose some of the words that I want to say.
Very good. Okay. So what happens when the schedule changes like crazy? Does that create anxiety?
It freaks me out, and I feel like I don't have enough time to get things done, and then when we have to think of it on the fly, it can mess everything up for the day.
Absolutely. Okay. So how do you feel about the rules in your life?
I feel like it's very different from other people, but also it has to be done that way for weight and for calories and everything, and then
do you have some rules at home that you live by?
Yeah, my fridge is to be locked, my pantry is to be locked, and then other people are allowed to eat in front of me as long as I need, and maybe an hour afterwards.
Okay. So if things were left unlocked at home, what would happen?
I could eat everything. Yeah, I can get really sick.
Very good. Okay. No, that's not very good. It's just that you're right. Absolutely.
It's not a good thing, but it's
right. But it's a serious thing, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And then my last question: what's the one thing that you would want people to know about Prader-Willi Syndrome?
Even if you don't have the greatest balance or you don't have the greatest strength, you will build it up. And I think one of the biggest things for a lot of people is spending a lot of time with dogs and horses. And you may not even know how your world could change if you were on horseback.
So how did your world change being on horseback?
My balance is better, and I just stick at home because I love horses so much, and I can just be there all the time.
Do you have to work on your balance differently than other people? Or not?
A little bit, but not.
Okay. All right. Because you're trying to get stronger.
You have to more work on your upper body strength and then your leg strength.
Good. All right. Very good. Well, this is the very first time that I've ever done this. It's the very first time you've ever done this, and you did incredible. Did you have anything else you wanted to share?
No.
Not really? Okay. Excellent. All right. Well, we're going to move to...
Can I speak with you for 1 second? Can you add the other stuff that I talked about in the webinar? No.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. So Grace is thinking that maybe I can add some of the other conversations that we've had and kind of share it as I go through my section of the webinar.
I froze up pretty bad.
No, you did great. You did great. Yeah, that was very good. You can just wait here for me, okay? We're going to go do Lisa next. Okay, Lisa. So our first question is...
I'll be able to record.
Everybody has a story. Tell me a little bit about your story.
My parents didn't know what. My mom knew there was something wrong with the child that she was carrying before she was full term with me. And she knew it was a girl, but she didn't know what was wrong. She knew something was seriously wrong, but she didn't know what. And then they took me to doctors, in and out of doctors. They went into debt trying to figure out what doctors. Nobody seemed to know until this Ruth Owen at the Cleveland Clinic said, I know exactly what's wrong with your child. And she says, oh God, what, is it serious? My mom said that. And she said, they said, yes, it can be serious. It looks like we caught it just in time. And she suffers from Prader-Willi Syndrome is what she's got.
And how is that different now when how do people find out that somebody might have Prader-Willi Syndrome?
They're either taken to a doctor or somebody that knows the family or is around them or has somebody in the family or in relatives or something that has it. They'll know, or they'll say, I have a friend who has Prader, and I mean, she or he's showing the same characteristics and the same things that they do.
And they can find out when they're babies now, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Genetically, they do.
Genetically.
Okay, so did you want to share anything else about your story?
I love puzzles and animals, and I love walks. And when I get my next apartment, which is going to be in Marywood, I'm thinking about getting just a 1-bedroom because the roommate situation isn't working out.
Okay.
And I think maybe unless we can find me another roommate, I might just get a 1-bedroom and with a large bedroom, and that would be it. And I'd buy me a dog, adopt a dog for Tri-State Collie Rescue, because I love dogs, and I've grown up with dogs all my life.
Okay. So, am I allowed to ask you about your age since it's already on the screen?
Yes.
So, how old are you?
I will be 59 on the 2nd of next month.
And what distinction does that give you?
Well, I'm the oldest Prader-Willi that they know in the state of Ohio. It could be country-wide.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the country, but okay. Good. All right, so what's it like living with Prader-Willi? You say Prader, I say Prader, huh?
Anything, it's basically, you've got a child or you know someone that has it, you good to give. It's not comfortable. It sure isn't. It's different. Living, we're not normal. I mean, it's very hard to be around people that are normal, that can eat normally and not have to worry about gaining weight and putting on pounds, and it's hard. It's hard. It's hard. You gotta watch your weight. You gotta exercise, and make sure that you try and keep active because of the low muscle tone.
Okay. How do you feel about some of the rules that are in your life?
Well, I don't like the rules, but I've learned to live with them because I understand now why they're in place, because if there wasn't rules, I could literally kill myself. And there's others that could too, if they aren't in a controlled environment.
So what happens for you when the rules aren't followed?
I get into food that I shouldn't, and it makes it hard on me, and then I have behaviors because I'm in trouble. And I have learned that doesn't happen anymore because staff knows that they're locked the refrigerator at the apartment and the freezer, and that the cupboards, I'm not allowed in the kitchen while they're cooking or prep working for the next day. And
what if they leave them unlocked?
I tell them, you better lock that, because what happens if you have to go to the bathroom or something? You can't leave me here alone. You know what's happened before when it's been unlocked. I says, you need to lock the refrigerator and the freezer and make sure you take everything that's in reach and put it up higher where I can't reach it.
Okay. So what would be the one thing that you want other people to understand or know about Prader-Willi?
The thing that if it's not caught early in life, or if it is caught early and you still have problems with your child or someone that your friend that knows, the good advice is to keep the food up out of their reach and keep all refrigerators and cupboards locked.
Is this just really about a diet and that's all?
No, it's serious. It could be serious. Literally, it's like people with PWS could kill themselves.
Okay.
Because all we do is gorge and gorge and gorge. Eat, eat, eat. That's all we know. The brain tells us we're hungry, but I mean, if we're tempted by something, by food, or somebody offers food to you, I mean, you can easily say, yes, I want it, and we could get ourselves into a whole lot of trouble for taking it, because there's got to be somebody with us 24/7 all day long, or otherwise we'd be dead by now.
That's very true.
At a very early age.
And I'm going to go back to Grace for a second. Is that okay that I do this? And I want to ask you about your sensory needs, like about Special Olympics, about the big swing. Tell me a little about that.
Okay.
Like Special Olympics, what do you do there?
The biggest sensory for me is touching the dogs and touching the horses,
Mm-hmm.
but also getting exercise in something that I love doing, also swimming is another huge thing for me because it helps me build up my leg strength doing the kicking and also a lot of the different movements. Butterfly has also given me so much upper body strength for horseback riding.
Excellent.
And then third putty helps me build up my hamstrings so that I can hold on to the reins and not drop them.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Okay. So tell me about that big swing. You just came from camp, right, at Rec Unlimited, and there's a big swing there.
I love roller coasters. The horseback riding and swimming has helped me get up ladders easier and hold my balance. And then also stepping down. Swimming has really helped with that.
Good. So you love all the stuff that gives you the roller coaster feeling or any of that, right?
Or exercise.
So do I.
And yeah, I know you do too. Yeah, those are big things. And that's going to help your system tolerate all the other things that are going on, right? All the rules that you have to live by and those kinds of things so that you can survive and have a good life. Okay.
And I like going on mini vacations with where we going up that a long time ago, C.D. Seiler. I mean, it started with later when she got ready to leave, but it was after she moved. She went away. That we go on mini vacations now.
So how do you have to plan for that?
Staff have to set it up, usually the manager or whatever, and we go on. We were gonna go to Kings Island next weekend, but Bob's talking about she doesn't know whether we're gonna go because the weather's supposed to be crappy. It's supposed to be cold and it's supposed to rain.
Okay.
So we might not go. We might go somewhere else and play indoor putt-putt golf or something like that.
So being spontaneous is a little bit hard, right?
Yeah.
Changes to your schedule are also a little
Can I
bit
talk
hard.
about vacation a little bit?
Sure, go ahead and talk about vacation. This will be the last thing we do.
So vacation, it is very difficult with every food decision you make, and also when your friend comes in and they bring extra treats, you have to know that ahead of time. And also planning the place that you go or places that you know that are there with the food is very helpful because the calories aren't known. But also we just watch portions instead of calories.
Excellent. I want to thank both of you. This is not something that either of you have done before, and you did an excellent, excellent job. So I really want to thank you for being here, for being so patient. We had a little trouble getting set up this morning, and you guys were incredibly patient through all of that, too.
And thank you for adding other stuff in there.
No problem. No problem.
Thank you.
All right. So this picture, we wanted to make sure that we got a picture with Lisa and Grace standing side by side, since you didn't get to see them do their presentation. And this is significant because Grace, 17 years old, did have growth hormone, and Steve's going to go into a little bit more of the medical side of things, but she did have growth hormone, which has given her the advantage of really spreading her body mass out, and Lisa did not. That's something that when Lisa was diagnosed wasn't around. So the fact that they still have both of them have low tone, and that doesn't change. It's just that the tone gets spread out a little bit further. So we wanted to make sure you got a picture of both of them. They were super excited about being able to share with us today, and I have to give them tons and tons of credit for kind of stepping into a nerve-wracking situation and doing so well. And now Steve's going to go through some of the medical pieces, and then I'll finish up with some of the kinds of restrictions and plans and target behaviors, that kind of thing.
Okay, so thanks Lisa and Grace, and thanks Jean. So I'm Steve Fetsko, and as you see here, I'm president of PWSA of Ohio, but I'm also a parent of a child with Prader-Willi Syndrome. I'm an engineer by trade, but most of this information in here is medically based. So we went through with the doctors and learned all the information that you see in here. So I've got a little agenda here: general description, the genetics, the stages, the physical characteristics and the behavioral characteristics, all the health risks that are involved with Prader-Willi syndrome, and then other things to consider. So genetically, if you look at the books, it'll tell you that Prader-Willi syndrome, it has an insatiable appetite, behavior problems, poor growth, and learning disabilities or mental retardation. This is just the tip of the iceberg. So when my son was born 19 years ago, this is pretty much all they had. But we've learned a lot since then. But we didn't start learning until about 1956, when Dr. Prader, Dr. Lamhart, and Dr. Willi described the syndrome and clinically gave it a clinical diagnosis name. So before 1956, obviously the syndrome was there because it's a genetically based syndrome, but nobody characterized it to even start working on any supports or interventions. Now, again, genetically, when you're looking at Prader-Willi syndrome, it's about 1 in 12,000 births that the child will have Prader-Willi syndrome. So if you look at the estimates from 2013, the U.S. population would be somewhere around, let's say, 25,000. The Ohio population would be about 850. But the problem is that Prader-Willi syndrome is misdiagnosed in many cases. So 60% of them are unaccounted for. So we only know of about 40% of them across the country. And when you're looking at Ohio specifically, what I did was I broke it down into the different counties. So again, we should have maximum 964 people with Prader-Willi syndrome inside of Ohio, not counting any morbidity changes or adjustments. But if you look at this, half of the counties in Ohio would have an average or an estimate of 4 people with Prader-Willi syndrome or less. So for somebody to become an expert in one of these counties that has a very small population is extremely challenging. So there's got to be more collaboration, and that's part of our goal here is to spread the news and let you be more aware of what Prader-Willi syndrome is. So again, we go back to the genetics, and this is coming from the father's 15th chromosome. And again, I put in here 1 in 12 to 15,000 births. There is no known cause. If you are familiar with Angelman syndrome, that is a sister syndrome. So instead of the genetics being a disconnection in the father's side, it is on the mother's side. But in Prader-Willi syndrome, and as in Angelman syndrome, there would be 3 forms. There would be a long deletion, a short deletion, and a uniparental disomy, and I'll go into that in a second. But because there's these 3 different genetic basics for the syndrome, it creates a very wide symptom spread in the symptoms that show up. So on the left-hand side here, you would see the normal genes. Some are turned on by both parents, the black ones. Some would be inactive, the white ones. Some are turned on by the father only, the blue ones. And some would be turned on by the mother, which would be the red ones. And so on a short deletion, you see a segment that's missing. In the DNA, there just happens to be a natural bright spot in a few areas. So you can either get a short deletion or a long deletion. And on the right-hand side, you have 2 genes from the mother. So in the short deletion, you're missing some of the genes. Long deletion, obviously, you're missing more genes. So again, symptom changes. But on the UPD, you can see not only are you missing the blue genes, but you've added extra red genes from the mother. So I'm one of the unique fathers that could actually say, my son's problems are because he got too much of my wife and not enough of me. And I get away with that because it's true here. And I point that out, yes, it's a joke, but it also helps you understand that there's a very broad spread between the genes that are happening, not to mention the expression of those genes, which is what we end up seeing in the proteins and the enzymes and everything else that they generate. Now, Prader-Willi syndrome starts off as an oxymoron. You're starting off with a floppy baby. You're starting off with a baby that needs to be force-fed to survive. So we're looking at failure to thrive. Many of the kids will end up with either the nose tube or a gastro tube into the stomach, so that it can be the baby can be force-fed. So you've got excessive sleepiness. They're going to not follow the normal milestones. So this is in contrast to what we typically hear, but this is my son when he was 1 week old. He couldn't even open up his eyes at that time. He was so weak. So this is where most of them start their first week. But then after a few years, in the early supports, now there's growth hormone, which starts almost immediately. All the early childhood developments are delayed, so you would expect physical therapy, speech therapy, occupational therapy, and certainly a lot of guidance for the parents to help them understand what's on the horizon. But after a few years, somewhere between 3 and 9 typically, you would start going into the thriving too well. This is when the weight would start increasing, the behaviors would start increasing, the learning disabilities would show up more severe, speech language problems, and social isolation. They have a hard time interacting with their peers. Most of this starts off from being a brain-based issue. It's initially starting off with the hypothalamus. So when you talk about Prader-Willi syndrome and the effects, you can see a direct correlation between the hypothalamus dysfunctioning. It's there, it has some function to it, but it dysfunctions. So the hypothalamus is related to growth hormone, it's related to appetite control, low metabolism, body temperature regulation, and it really controls a lot of the systems inside of your body. So when I look at the comparison here, we all hear about the pituitary gland, but most people don't hear about the hypothalamus very much. But if you look at these 3 areas, you've got the growth hormone. In essence, the hypothalamus tells the pituitary to create growth hormone. If the hypothalamus is not working, then it doesn't tell the pituitary, and the pituitary does not create growth hormone. Same with oxytocin, vasopressin, and several other hormone systems. And this is just another way of looking at it. If you look at the hypothalamus regulations, you've got growth hormone, satiety, homeostasis, sexual development, sleep, and stress. You've got a direct link into the syndrome for the symptoms for Prader-Willi syndrome. The other brain-based portion of Prader-Willi syndrome is during the development, the frontal lobe does not develop completely. So since it's underdeveloped, and we're looking at different issues as reasoning in the frontal lobe, impulse control, problem solving, and social sexual behavior, these are clearly symptoms that we see in Prader-Willi syndrome also. So these 2 sections of the brain are where Prader-Willi really starts. Okay, so the problem we get into is when our children are developing, there's many of them that will fall into a typical IQ. So as you meet these people and you don't know that they have Prader-Willi syndrome, you may meet one that has 100 IQ, and you will say, okay, this gentleman or this lady is going to be able to survive in society just fine. But they're not going to test functionally on their daily capabilities as they're going to show on their IQ level. Now, the benefit is that the IQ will not go down. Some symptoms or syndromes will lose IQ points over time. This is not true for Prader-Willi syndrome. So some of the physical characteristics, again, the hypotonia, as Lisa and Grace talked about, they have the low muscle tone. So now you're not generating heat and energy by having your muscles contracted all day long. So now their metabolism is substantially lower. So with that, without treatment, you could easily see 800 calories a day maximum. And usually when you look at the FDA, you're going to talk about 2,000 calories a day for a typical person. So 800 calories many times is my lunch. And these people have to survive on it all day long. Other developmental delays would be typically in the early stages, about 1 to 3 years. Many don't walk effectively until they're 5 or 6. Speech and language will maintain throughout the course of their life. They have troubles. Another one that shows up is osteoporosis. So it's interesting because of the low muscle tone, their body skeletal system acts more like the astronauts in space. They don't get the pressure put on the bones, so the bones don't grow as fast or grow as hard. So this can be very common in both men and women and as early as age 30. So it's something to watch out for when they fall, that they can break a bone much earlier, much easier. Short stature and dysmorphology. Several of these issues are taken care of with the growth hormone replacement now. So obviously the height, but also you would normally see small hands and feet, a high palate, almond-shaped eyes. These physical characteristics are minimized these days. So the big one would be with the excessive appetite control. And what I want to point out is many of them will eat their food extremely fast. If you can imagine not having food for 3 weeks and then getting a large piece of pizza, how fast you're going to eat that. So shoving becomes the big issue. Cutting their food up for them is a big issue. Not having food visible to them, because again, their appetite control is like they haven't had food for 3 weeks. Controlling your money and their money, so they can't go to the store and just buy food. These are all big issues. And I happened to be looking for the location of this building on Friday, and I ran across this on the DODD website. And again, yes, choking is a big issue in the DODD community in general, but with Prader-Willi syndrome, it's even got that heightened issue that's included in top of it. So it's a very big issue. We had 5 or 6 years ago, one of our ladies in Ohio passed away from choking. Now, the irony was she was in the hospital for specialty care, and she choked on a potato and died. So this is not an issue that you have to watch out for once in a while. This is a daily issue that you have to be careful for. Perseverative thinking is a unique issue to Prader-Willi syndrome. They get stuck on a subject or potentially even a person. It's a very challenging behavior to control and maintain as a support person, because they'll ask the same question over and over again. So you have to find strategies that work. You have to get them to understand what's going to happen next. Sometimes setting a rule as to how many times they can ask the question. Sometimes making them put it in writing helps their brain to get past that issue. But it is a brain-based issue. So they also have a rigid thought process. Most of them have a very, very controlled need for routine and consistency. You also heard Lisa and Grace that when their schedules get out of control and things happen spontaneously, they have a very hard time working through these issues. So the first thing is, don't ever promise. I've never promised my son anything in the last 10 years. I tell him what the plan is, and we try to stick to the plan. Hopefully we go through the plan cleanly. And that works fairly well for me, but each person is going to be slightly different. But this can also be a problem when you're dealing with work-related issues. If they're supposed to go to stage 1 and then go to stage 2, well, if stage 1 has too many people there and they have to go to stage 2, it's going to become a behavioral problem because that's not where they're supposed to be. So most of the people with Prader-Willi syndrome that I've met have some amount of autism spectrum in them. It's not the clear autistic structure that you see in a classical autism person, but it is there, and they have the social skill problems, they have the rigid thought process, and they get focused on certain interests. But these things can help us because they like to have the rules controlling their surroundings. Since they can't understand the surroundings, they have a need to have an understanding of the rules that help them be safe in those surroundings. And some of the people can be, we can use the rules to help them control their eating behavior, such as you have to cut your pieces up into small pieces before you start eating. You can only eat one piece of food and then count to 6. These types of behaviors could help you in those severe cases where somebody's shoving too much, could help you in other areas. Again, they have difficulty in peer socialization. It comes back to the autistic-like symptoms. They do want to interact with their surroundings. They do want to have friends. They just have a very hard time. I think one of the big problems is the rest of the world is very spontaneous. And this gets them into situations where they seem negative when their friends want to go do something spontaneous. And really what it is it's the need for consistency that's keeping them from engaging. Now, emotional control is a big part of Prader-Willi Syndrome. And what you can also see as part of this is oppositional defiance. So as their mood swings, and it does swing both ways very quickly, when they're in a negative mood swing, it is very close to oppositional defiance in most of them. And it can be unwarranted or unexplainable. They may not be talking logically. So if there's a severe situation and a police or fire or someone comes up with an authority, they may still be very negative towards those people. So it's something they need to be aware of ahead of time to try to respect authority and give them those guidances ahead of time so they're not caught up in this emotional control problem during a emergency situation. Now, staff needs to also be aware that any negative speech towards them during this situation will escalate the aggression. So you always want to keep calm, talk softly, and continue on with your normal pattern of speech. Then the other way to benefit from this is you can explain that it's the rules and not the person, because we don't want them to have emotional defiance towards the staff or the people around them and injure anyone around them. So using the rule as being the bad person or the reason for having to have this situation calm down is a much better situation. So health risks are numerous. As you see all these pop up, you very rarely hear any of these other than the obesity and the appetite. But all of these are very common in Prader-Willi syndrome and challenging potentially. So we'll start off with the appetite control. And again, most people are aware that Prader-Willi syndrome people have an insatiable appetite. So they could eat a 1,000-calorie dinner and still be hungry when they're done. There have been studies in the past that do show that they do have some form of appetite suppressant, but the study showed that they would have to eat 20 hamburgers for that person to start controlling their behavior on their own or their appetite on their own. So again, I point out the fact that if they are admitted into the hospital, many of them enjoy this because now they get food, real food, meatballs and mashed potatoes and meatloaf and spaghetti and all the food that they normally want because the hospital isn't fully aware. So they have to be warned ahead of time that the calorie count and the food needs to be adjusted before they get to the person with Prader-Willi syndrome. Because once the food is in front of them and they've seen it, you've already lost the battle. You have to make that decision ahead of time. And you have to remember, this is a neurological problem. This is not something they can really control. This is what happens when it can't be controlled. So you have this lady who was a very sweet young lady, but by 4, she was 85 pounds. And by 21, she passed away. The environment around her was not controlling her food, and she couldn't control it herself. You see the Diet Coke. So yes, she was trying, but trying doesn't succeed most of the time. And the other issue is the surroundings can't be minimized to the house or minimized to the school or minimized to one location. Because if somebody at school is giving them a cookie every single day, and that's 150 calories per cookie, you're looking at, after 12 years of school, 187 extra pounds that this person has gained just because of one cookie a day. So you have to watch their friends and make sure that their friends understand why one cookie matters. Because as a parent, we hear that from friends, grandparents, siblings, everybody in the world says, it's just one cookie. But one cookie equals 187 pounds. This is what happens when you get the environment controlled. So at 20, she was obviously over 300 pounds and in danger of passing away. But 7 years later, she got into an environment that controlled the situation. And this is the lady on the left, and she's there at I think it's a Special Olympics event, and she's doing wonderful. So, of course, the complications of obesity, we all hear those: heart problems, diabetes, right side heart failure, and sleep apnea. But the ones you don't hear about are high pain tolerance. This is something that is very hard to understand until you see it. The deep pain that we would normally feel, they don't feel. The surface feelings that they have, they will feel those and feel like they're being punched or damaged, because the light sensations, many of them will have the sensory integration problems, but the deep pain they don't feel. A 2-year-old tried to get up onto a cabinet, fell over, broke his arm, and never told his mom. Of course, he was getting up to go get a cookie out of the cabinet, and she only knew he had a broken arm because he was coloring with the wrong arm later that day. They don't feel this. And along with that, skin picking is very common in Prader-Willi syndrome because they don't feel the pain, but they do say they feel something at times. So now it feels more like an agitation or an itch. So they will pick at different locations, and each person can be different. It may be their lips, their fingernails, their arm, their leg. But these can become extremely severe because once the irritation is there, now they see the irritation or they feel it more, and they'll go more aggressive after that area. There are cases, and I've witnessed it recently, where the picking can go all the way to the bone, and they're not feeling that situation the way we would expect them to. So we've asked them in the past, one gentleman said, it doesn't hurt when I pick. I actually feel something, and feeling's good. He liked the feeling or the sensation, so it allowed him to continue going all the way to the bone. But the problem is these can be open long enough to become septic, and now you're talking about fever or severe issues. And we had somebody pass away 10 years ago again from sepsis because they didn't keep the sores clean enough. Along that same line, their gastric system does not process the food properly. It's extra slow. So now the food is staying in their system. And if you could imagine a Prader-Willi person who gets out, goes on a binge, eats as much as they can, and now their stomach is completely full, but it's unable to empty because their system doesn't process the food properly. So a ruptured stomach is a very common, I shouldn't say very common, but it's very likely to happen in those types of situations, and yet they will not feel it because the pain isn't there, as we just talked about. So they may feel uneasy or feel different. Watch the small signs, just like this mom with her son. She noticed that he was coloring with the wrong hand. Then she investigated and found out. Gastroparesis, so the stomach and the colon, again, process are very slow. Almost all of them are constipated most of the time. Many will take laxatives or Miralax every single day in order to keep their systems moving. But again, their stomach can rupture much more likely than the rest of the population. So it's something to watch out for. The other issue that the hypothalamus helps control is the body temperature. But since their body temperature is not controlled properly, their normal temperature may not be 98.6. My son's normal body temperature is about 96. So when we went to the hospital recently for a toe infection, his body temperature showed up as 98.4. They said it was normal, and we said, no, that's a 2.4 degree increase, which would actually mean 101 temperature for the normal person. And then they looked at his toe and said, yes, that's infected. The toenail needs to come off. Well, the body was reacting to that toenail problem, but it wasn't reacting the way we were expecting it to. So it almost got missed. Not by the parents, luckily, but by the staff there. Other respiratory concerns is since they have a weak muscle tone, their chest muscles are weaker, so they don't breathe quite as deep and effectively as the rest of the people. And certainly the weight, if they're obese, is going to cause more and more trouble. And along with this can be sleep apnea. So sleep apnea is very common in Prader-Willi syndrome, not just obstructive sleep apnea like we normally think, but also brain-based, which means the brain forgets to tell the body to sleep at times, or to breathe while they're sleeping. So it is common for Prader-Willi syndrome people to have sleep studies done on a regular basis. Recent studies have also shown adrenal insufficiency is more common. So this is when your body gets stressed, it creates insulin and allows it to manage that stress. So anytime there's a surgery where you're going under general anesthesia, this could become an issue as your body gets under shock. And deep vein thrombosis. Again, there was a clinical study being done, and in the last 2 years, we had some inclination that a drug was finally going to start working for Prader-Willi syndrome. But during the early studies, there were 2 people that fatally died during the study because of pulmonary embolisms. This was not known to be a common cause in Prader-Willi syndrome, but after the fact, there were studies that were looking at morbidity and found that many times the fatality was misdiagnosed as right side heart failure, thinking it was from the obesity, but it turned out to be pulmonary embolisms and they were misdiagnosed. So this is an ongoing study of this issue. It's unknown how common this is. So what you're going to see in your daily life as you're dealing with those with Prader-Willi syndrome is a change. When my son was born 19 years ago, most of those people with Prader-Willi syndrome were diagnosed in their mid-teens. By that time, they were already overweight, already having behavior problems, and they weren't, the surroundings around them weren't set up to allow them to be successful. But currently, the diagnosis is happening as infants. So the medical field has learned a tremendous amount about Prader-Willi syndrome in the last 20 years. Most of the neonatal facilities are catching this in the infancy stage. My son was diagnosed, luckily, at 6 weeks. Again, that was 19 years ago. But almost every person in the last 5 years that I've met, or family that I've met, that had a new child with Prader-Willi syndrome diagnosed was under the age of 3. So what that allows the families to do is set up the environment around them to allow for weight management to happen from an early onset. And we all know it's much easier to keep the weight off early than to try and lose the weight later. But what you need to remember is that weight management does not equal a cure. This was my son when he was 16 years old at a dance, and he would have been 98 pounds and about 5'2". So you would not know that he has Prader-Willi syndrome by the looks of him there, but he does. He still has the excessive appetite. It's only the environment that keeps him at that weight level. So things to keep in mind. So when you're looking at housing, as Lisa said, not all housemates are compatible. You have physical activity levels. You have daily calorie. If one person's getting 1,500 calories and one is getting 600 calories, that's going to be very challenging for the person with 600 calories. Most will need the food to be locked up, but some also need toothpaste to be locked up or other non-food type items. Even the house temperature could be a problem because one person's metabolism might say 96 and one might say 98, and now your house temperature has to adjust for that internal body adjustment that's happening there. It also could be interests or work settings. Now, when you're looking at work settings, the one most people forget is not the food that's in the cafeteria, but the vending machines, the condiments, other co-workers, or the trash cans, of course. We've all heard stories about those with Prader-Willi Syndrome going in trash cans and eating the food out of it. So everybody has to be aware of where all the food is. Perseveration, I think, could be a problem at many locations. Again, and they may be getting stuck on a topic. And if you're working on a machine and you're talking about horses or talking about the day you had yesterday and you want to tell somebody, that machine is what your job is and your task is. And they have a hard time breaking away from that situation and not telling you about their day yesterday. So integration into the community. So as Lisa was saying, food access in our society is so prevalent that it really limits their ability to interact cohesively. If there's food around, they're going to be either eating the food or looking at the food and not interacting with those around them. So if you go to the movies, everybody else has popcorn and soda. So you have to plan for that. Either bring a small bag of popcorn with you or have a plan for you're going to go somewhere afterwards to make sure that they're comfortable sitting in that room with everybody else. All the other social events, usually there's snacks, cookies, drinks, punch. These situations have to be pre-discussed and pre-planned. The other one here is exploitation. So because the Prader-Willi Syndrome person not only has the excessive appetite, but also some of the poor judgment, exploitation can become a very quick and damaging issue. And Jean's going to talk about that a little bit more. But I think as a parent, success is got to be supported in every environment, not just the house, not just the work, not just the school. And all the rules have to be, if not exactly the same, very similar. Everybody has to understand where the food is coming from, where the calories are happening, and it needs to be consistent for their benefit, not for ours. Again, socialization, I think as they grow up, they socialize more with adults than their peers. But as they get into a group home setting where they get into being adults, they want to have friends. I think it's a good thing for them to get into a group home setting if they can find 3 friends they can live with, or allow them to interact socially with others in the community, both in the PW community, but in the general population community too. So this is very challenging for them though. And again, success, I think the best success is probably going to be across county lines in those 50% of those counties that have a very small population. It's not going to be easy to find roommates or a suitable support staff in a small county that is only trying to support 1 or 2 people. And I think that click through. So I just have a few pictures of how Prader-Willi Syndrome Association of Ohio helps them socialize. So we have a festival each year to get together. We get the families together, let them have fun, and teach them some about different issues of the syndrome. We also have a fall camp, which we just had this past weekend again. And in fact, Grace's picture is right in the middle of this one from 2015. And we get about 35 to 45 people that come together. And this is Prader-Willi Syndrome only. Because all the food is controlled 100% here, they can let down their guard. They know what they're supposed to get every time. The schedule is the same on the food schedule. The activities are different each day, but the food schedule is always the same, so they always know. And then we have lately been doing a snowflake ball where we bring all the families together and we do a red carpet to highlight all their achievements. So Grace will show up for achievement, and same with Lisa, of doing these presentations. And so my thought is there's many people out there with Prader-Willi syndrome, and I truly feel it's all about their needs, and each one is going to be an individual, and each one is going to need different needs, but you have to understand Prader-Willi syndrome first before you can help them survive in this world here. So there's a couple places that have Prader-Willi syndrome clinics. One is in Cleveland, one is in Columbus, and Cincinnati is working on getting one officially started, where they can go not just to see a geneticist, but an endocrinologist, a psychologist, and a dietitian in these locations. And some of the standard residential support groups, we have REM in the Northeast Ohio, Minnemeyer, Sunshine Creating Community up in the Toledo area, and we're adding to this. And if you have any questions, you can certainly reach out to Prader-Willi Syndrome Association of Ohio.
Thank you, Steve, for your section of the presentation. And now I'm going to be going over some information about plans and how to approach the Human Rights Committee and all of that. My name is Jean Stuntz, and I'm with Dynamic Pathways. So we're going to talk a little bit about structure, and this is probably one of the reasons why I have been really advocating for a webinar on Prader-Willi syndrome, because the structure is so important for people. And sometimes when human rights committees work or look over a plan, they don't quite understand the need for that kind of structure. And so I'm going to discuss a little bit about what ought to probably be in a plan for somebody, and what types of measures work for people. So each person that I've known of has had some specific types of things in their plans, and it usually involves their diet, their routine, actual rules, clear rules so that they know what to expect, clear and consistent reinforcements, and then behavior intervention when things fall apart. So we're going to discuss these, each of these areas. The recommended diet is the stoplight diet, and that diet has worked for many people. A person with Prader-Willi needs about 60% fewer calories. I've had staff tell me in the past that that we are starving people, that it's not fair that we give people that little food, and yet they don't quite understand the reason why. There are a lot of calories, as Steve said, might range from 600 to 1,500. Usually when they leave, if they do go to the Children's Institute in Pittsburgh, they will typically leave on about 800 calories. The stoplight diet, it's red, green, and yellow for a reason. Green go foods, the first time I talked to someone and they said, I want my green goes, I didn't quite understand what that meant, but they were talking about their green go foods. Yellow is caution, be careful, and red is stop. So here's some examples of green go foods. I knew a lady one time that needed to she used to make a condiment mixture. Because they're green go foods, she felt like she could put pretty much anything in that condiment mixture. And it was a lot of different very crazy stuff that she added together, all being under the green go category, but would not typically go together. And she used that with her vegetables in the afternoon. Caution foods. As you would expect, we're talking about some of the natural sugars, milk, dairy, meats. At that point, we have to, be a little bit more concerned about. We have to measure and weigh everything. But then we get to the red stop foods, and those are going to be things like fast foods, fats and oils, milk and dairy, meats that are more fatty. Oftentimes, when people are living in an apartment or in a group home, lots of times the diet prescribes that there could be one red day a month. And that makes it very, very hard for people to manage if they're trying to negotiate a red day with staff. Oftentimes the red day happens with families. And so that doesn't put the staff in a position to ever have to say, okay, we're going to have a red day. Which doesn't mean that food portions aren't controlled. It just means that some of these foods are a part of their menu that day. Oh, and sweets, of course, the donuts and the cookies and the cakes. So part of the plan really has to be about a consistent schedule. Following a restricted diet while constantly wanting food, it just creates a lot of anxiety for people. The actual structure and plan, even though it's rigid, and it would be rigid to many of us, it does provide the person with Prader-Willi syndrome a sense of security. And I've had people tell me, no, I would rather be on a plan than how I felt when I wasn't. Because at that point I was constantly thinking about food, trying to figure out how I could get something I wasn't allowed or something that I knew would get me in trouble. The schedule also it makes it hard for people when they have too much free time. So oftentimes the schedule in the day is pretty prescribed. They know when meals are, they're on time, and around those meals they know what happens in between. So sometimes people feel that people that don't understand Prader-Willi syndrome would feel that that is too rigid a schedule for someone, and yet it really isn't. It helps them feel safe. So food security is a huge piece. It needs to be in the plan. This is likely going to be one of your restrictions, but they do need to know when meals will occur and what's going to be, that foods will be served on time. They don't really want for things to change. If they do feel like things will change in terms of their menu or whatever, they will often negotiate their next meal. Take 1 ounce of this away and add 2 tablespoons of peanut butter. And even if the calories are correct, it creates anxiety for them, that the fact that they could negotiate each meal. Earlier we heard from Lisa and Grace, and they both were very focused on their food today, which is expected. And even though they're very accomplished in being able to share what's going on in their life with Prader-Willi syndrome, they also still feel that anxiety. So they're secure when they don't have disappointments that relate to false expectations around food. They need to know what it's going to be and when it's going to happen. So there needs to be a plan in place. Exercise is important, and this is due to the low tone as well as for other reasons. Oftentimes it's recommended that the individual with Prader-Willi exercise an hour or more per day. That's what the doctor's recommendations have been, and while we know that exercising an hour or more is not something that most of us can refuse to do, if people with Prader-Willi syndrome did not exercise, there's a lot of consequences that come. Part of it is the lower tone, as Grace was talking about. They have low tone in the first place, but if they don't do the exercise, then they have even a harder time with their low tone. They also have a harder time burning their calories. But there's also sensory reasons for doing this as well. And so some of the points that Steve brought up about autism and their sensory needs are super important here. Oh, I forgot the bone density. That was one other area. Because they don't have good bone density, the exercise is important, as well as for energy release. If the energy doesn't get released through exercise, it's going to get released some way. And sometimes that's through a behavioral episode. So motivation. Sometimes people question the schedule that someone might use or work with around people with Prader-Willi syndrome, because oftentimes the exercise is just really hard to stay motivated. So it's scheduled at the clinics and also in many of people's plan, it's scheduled before snack and before TV and before something fun. So that people will know that when I get my exercise done, I get something. So we need clear rules. We need food rules, conduct rules, and usually there's some kind of house rules. Now I know that rules is kind of a dirty word with some groups, and we know that house rules or corporate rules is really difficult when it comes to Human Rights Committee, that we need to look at those closely. And because we're supposed to be doing person-centered planning, it's supposed to be one person at a time. And when the rules come in, then it starts to look a lot more like it's some kind of advantage for staff convenience or something. But for the ladies, I mean, one of the reasons why I asked them the question about the rules is because if they don't use the rules or have those rules in their life, and they don't have a clear idea in their head about a rule, what the rule is about, they have a really hard time managing, and they will oftentimes argue and try to finagle a way to change the situation to their advantage. So, and that really, it's a neurological issue. It's not really more of they're just doing this to get away with something. They are wired to look for food, and they're wired with anxiety, and if we don't have some of these rules, then it's really difficult for them. There's a huge, huge piece of Prader-Willi syndrome that is focused on fairness. You see it with ADD as well, when you hear about, well, it's not fair, that person shouldn't be able to have more than I have. That's not fair, you didn't treat them the same way that you treated me. And so oftentimes when there's a house rule, it's not so much that the house rule is there because we don't want to have individual rules for people, but the house rules help to promote that environment of fairness that gives people security. So while rules is kind of a dirty word, we've tried to use the word guideline, we've tried to use, those kinds of things. And really, if I would talk to somebody with Prader-Willi syndrome about a guideline, they would talk to me about how it's not a rule, and that a guideline isn't the same as a rule. And so at least for this group of people that have Prader-Willi syndrome, the rules are important. The food rules, let's talk about these different sets of rules. All plans really are going to have to include some food monitoring, strict food monitoring. There's often, it's very rare that you don't find food locked. People will find a loophole. It's amazing that there's been times when I would ask a person, how did you get into the cabinet? Would you tell me? And people are way more honest if you ask them. And she told me, well, I took out the silverware drawer and I reached down in and I got it out of the cabinet. So I asked her to show me, because I'm thinking, how could you pull out the silverware drawer and somebody didn't hear you do that? And she showed me, and she didn't make a sound. She was able to take that silverware drawer out and reach the foods that were in the locked cabinet beneath. How about conduct rules? Or we can talk about what expectations people have, because when expectations are not met, it's very, very hard for people with Prader-Willi syndrome to continue their day. So they have to know what a clear picture of what the day is going to be, and what happens if they fulfill or don't fulfill the expectations of the day. Oftentimes that looks like a point system or something like that, but they need to know, what's coming. And Steve talked about this a little bit, that it's very important to be consistent and let the plan be the authority. So oftentimes when people say to me, well, I'm supposed to be able to, have extra food for my snack. I'll say, well, does the plan say that? And usually we'll go back, and sometimes we actually go to the written plan and we look at it together. Or I'll say, how about if I call the supervisor and make sure that because I don't want to get in trouble for not following the plan either. So how about if we call the supervisor? And oftentimes the answer I'll get is, well, we don't need to call the supervisor. What about consistent reinforcement? Lots of times you'll see people with some kind of point system, level system. When I was talking to Grace the other day, she has a stamp system that helps her walk through her day. It gives the person some feedback about getting really from meal to meal. And so I get points for doing the things that I need to do, and for being able to kind of keep it together and manage my anxiety. And usually the schedule moves from, because the meals are anchored at a specific time, lots of times there'll be, those anchor points and then what the schedule looks like in between. So in those kinds of systems, people will earn points for successfully completing any kind of expectation, which is positive, and there's no restriction there. The number of points earned sometimes determines the special privilege earned. So again, if this is beyond the regular privileges, but something extra special, oftentimes one of the things that we've included in there is that the staff would have to do the person's chore. And for whatever reason, people find that to be incredibly funny. And so they would work pretty hard to earn all their points so that their staff might have to do a chore of theirs or something. So those are the extra special privileges that they earn. Again, positive, no restriction there. So what about person-centered planning? You're going to find that most people with Prader-Willi syndrome will have restrictions written into their plans. I have run into situations where a family may not want to point out that the person has Prader-Willi, so they haven't really discussed and learned or even taught the person themselves much about the syndrome and what the limitations are, what some of the medical issues are. And so the person is oftentimes in crisis by that point because they just can't manage it on their own. So if you have restrictions in the plan, it actually improves consistency with the schedule, if it's a rigid schedule, with feedback for the person, with consequences, whether we're earning or not earning points. All of that helps the person feel a little bit more safe, gives them the plan to follow, the path that they know is going to happen for them. We've even had people where we've tried to do some fading and the person said, no, that is my plan and I'm not going to fade it. You know, they really, any change to that has made them feel incredibly unsafe. So, you know, we're going to talk a little bit about fading later, but, you know, there's times when people have that, the consistency of that schedule, and it brings such a measure of comfort for them. Often you're going to have to meet with the team. Most of the time, when somebody's living out on their own, the team is meeting. I mean, obviously they have restrictions, and so the team is required to touch base every 90 days. But very often the team meets every month. That's important because people like to negotiate for changes to benefit, you know, step outside the plan and benefit themselves, usually in a way that could cause harm to themselves. And so one of the rules that we talk about is not really making any changes to the plan until the team meets. So when somebody says to me, well, I think that maybe I should move my exercise to a different time, you know, we often will say, you know, that's something that we can talk about when your team meets. So that there aren't, that the team is cohesive and that everybody is working together and hearing the same message. So that there's not a lot of splintering and triangulating going on outside of the team process. We, again, place authority on the written document instead of on a specific person. We usually will have an answer person in each location so that if there's multiple staff and there's a question about something, that they can call the answer person, and that there would be somebody who will make a call on that issue between now and the next meeting. And then we'll deal with that at the meeting and follow up with the person that's on the plan to be able to know what changes we made and why, and what they think about it, and kind of create a plan going forward. So targeted behaviors, you're typically going to have them, and it's really due to the anxiety levels and living with being hungry all the time. I think Snickers made a commercial one time about being hangry, and if you took hangry times 100, that's what you're going to see. So you will have varying levels of behavior problems, and oftentimes most of them look like tantrums. Just not being able to cope anymore, just a complete meltdown. And so we call them tantrums when it seems like when we're talking about children. When we're talking about adults, we call them meltdowns. All of us have them. We just don't have them as often as people with Prader-Willi syndrome. So what does it include? Tantrums or outbursts, manipulation for sure, theft, you know, the whole argumentative piece about that goes back to the fairness piece, and this obsessive thinking that just cannot stop. Steve talked about it with when people are asking questions in perseverating on things that way. You know, they just can't move off the topic. They just get stuck there for a while. Well, there we are, perseveration and rigidity. So it's really, really important that people understand that there are no treatments that currently can eradicate the need for this high structure. You know, for when we say to people, you know, you need to fade something, be very careful on what you choose. There are ways for people to have more and more control over their life, and but it's not always in the typical ways that we think about behavioral support and fading. It's in other small ways that they can take on some extra privilege, or they can take on an extra responsibility that they feel good about. How is their life changing where they can have more control? But eradicating or saying, okay, well, you're doing fine, so all of a sudden you don't need the structure anymore, that's just going to make them decompensate. It's not possible for people with Prader-Willi to develop their skills to control their impulses when it comes to food. And I've had lots of people tell me, well, it wasn't my fault, the staff left it open. I was really pleased today when Lisa was telling me that, you know, she tells her staff, no, you better not leave that unlocked because I'm going to get into it, so lock it. And that kind of self-direction is amazing. And I would definitely list that as a way of having more control over her life. So what kinds of things do we see? Legal problems for sure. You see stealing at local 7-Elevens, that kind of thing. Trading sex for food is a common thing. Some people end up doing jail time, trespassing, going into other people's food, going into other people's garbage. There will be legal issues. And oftentimes, that's what we're looking at for rights restrictions is legal, what is the risk of harm or risk of legal sanction, and this would be the kind of baseline that you need to collect. I want to talk about food theft for a second. These are real pictures of a real incident where you know, somebody actually left. They said they want to spend time in their room, and that you have to leave me alone and give me privacy in my room, and they went out their window. Went in the window in the basement, and they would bring things home from workshop or whatever, and this is where they kind of kept their stash. Interesting random choices I mean, it's interesting sometimes when you find that somebody has stolen food that, you know, where did they get it? And sometimes we can't track it back. Sometimes it's been a long, long time ago. But I think the metal mucil packets is kind of interesting in that picture. The pumpkin's also interesting, since it's fall right now. You know, this was out the bedroom window, stole the pumpkin from the neighbors, brought it in the basement window, and you know, was keeping it actually in a cool spot so that it was cold. Other considerations, we've talked a little bit about the sensory integration, but this, I mean, we could talk forever just on the sensory issues, but anybody who has sensory issues are going to, they're going to be better able to cope with anything, any kind of stress in their life, any kind of disappointment or unmet expectation if they have their sensory needs met. And so because people with Prader-Willi face so many opportunities for stress and anxiety, it's super important that they have an opportunity to get their sensory needs met. And this is not when they're falling apart. This is well before they're falling apart. If we can get our sensory system, that neurological process in check, then they're going to be a whole lot more able to handle any kind of changes they get thrown at them. This is an example of sensory calming techniques. There's, you know, this boy is using a roller on his back. Most of the time we're talking about some kind of deep pressure. Again, you know, we had said that people aren't feeling things the same as you and I. So, you know, a deep pressure, warm bath, sleeping bags, weighted blankets, reduced noise, smells that are lavender, vanilla, or whatever, and even sucking is all stuff that would be calming for people. Now I'm going to quickly run through some do's and don'ts, and you know, we could actually talk about Prader-Willi syndrome all day, and we know that we have some limitations on time. So I'm going to run through some do's and don'ts, and a little bit of information on the Human Rights Committee, and then we'll be closing it up. Do keep food locked up at all times. Do weigh and measure everything. Two ounces of meat is not a lot of meat. You know, we go and order a 12-ounce steak. That 2 ounces of meat is small. Praise and recognize good performances, and make sure that person has some, has a heavy diet of reinforcement that way. Listen when a person needs to talk. They do need to share what's going on with them, and it's hard. It's hard to live. I think Lisa said it. It's hard to live with Prader-Willi syndrome. Think of fun ways to exercise and find reinforcers other than food. There are plans where food is a reinforcer, things like Tic Tacs and gum and things like that. It's best practice to find reinforcers that are other than food, but there are times when that's very hard to do. Include the person in the planning. Make sure you're giving some control back to them. So because the person doesn't often use good judgment, including them in the planning can sometimes have some undesired consequences, and they're suggesting that we, do something that would really be damaging for them. But we do need to find ways that they can be included, and within some kinds of constraints where they know, it can be, if let's say they are earning items, and the items that they're earning is, a stick of gum or something, and they're saying, well, I think I should earn a trip to, McDonald's instead. That's not going to be, that doesn't equal a stick of gum, so, having those conversations with them and working with the person to come up with something else that might be commensurate is important. Do's and don'ts. Remember that your logic and reasoning will not prevail. I've had so many times when people will just keep going and going and going with someone trying to make their point. It will not work. They are stuck, and you really have to recognize it as a brain issue at that point and let it go. Do plan your outings ahead of time. That's important. Do keep a calm attitude and a tone of voice. Enjoy your own food in private and eat similar things. It's really hard for a person with Prader-Willi to watch others eat. Be consistent. And then we're on to the don'ts. Don't assume that because a person with Prader-Willi syndrome is not overweight that they are cured. We've had people that have been within their ideal body weight, that got money for a birthday and went out and binged, and actually their stomach ruptured. So you can't assume that they're cured. Their brain is functioning the same way it did before they lost their weight. Don't nag and argue. Once the tantrum is over, don't bring it up again. It's just not worth it. Never use a controlling tone of voice, being very flat and in response to people. Encouraging is fine, but flat when it comes to something that's difficult is really the preferred way. When you're using a controlling tone, it's going to turn into a power struggle, and typically the staff do not win. Don't engage in a power struggle. The plan's the authority. I think we've said that a few times now. If clarification is needed, have a clear chain of command, and that's when I'm talking about an authority person. Don't promise anything that you cannot do. I think Steve talked about this as well. People with Prader-Willi do not do well with change or bargaining. I mean, they just won't. I used to work with a lady that had Prader-Willi syndrome, and she loved to go to yard sales and auctions. And the bargaining piece came out like crazy there. And she would go back and forth with the owner of the piece of property, whatever she was buying, going on and on and on. And it really would result in tears at the end. Don't forget that people with Prader-Willi syndrome, that it is life-threatening. Many people die every year because of stomach rupture or choking when they're given free access to food. I think I read a statistic recently. It was over 70% of people with Prader-Willi syndrome have sudden death. So, and the people that I've worked with in the past that have passed, all of a sudden somebody says, I don't think I feel well, and the next thing you know, they're we had to call the squad. So it's usually, some kind of a raging infection that's not known about because people don't feel it. All of that comes at the last minute, or the choking episodes all come at the last minute. So it really is life-threatening. Fading strategies. We are required to look at fading, and there's a good reason for that. We're required to do it because someone needs some kind of measures in their plan, restrictive measures in their plan, doesn't mean that they should be on it forever. Unfortunately, people with Prader-Willi syndrome will likely have restrictive measures for the duration of their lifetime because of the food access and that kind of thing. So it is important to still fade, and we need to look at that fading in baby steps. So don't fade to the point of decompensation. Nobody, when a human rights committee is requesting the team to look at fading, they're not saying, fade to the point that they fall apart. Obviously, that's not the desire for anyone. Take baby steps. Is there anywhere that we can safely give the person more control? And I think I talked about that a little bit already. But what is it that we can give that person control over? Even if it's something little. Even if it's posting something, or writing the schedule on the board instead of staff writing it on the board, whatever it could be, give that person back some control. Even less restrictions represent change. So this is where I was talking about somebody that has refused to reduce the restrictions in his plan. He actually was on a level system, and in a level system, you're actually going to be looking at some kind of a response cost. So I earn a level of privilege that's a high level of privilege, and if I mess up, maybe a target behavior or something, maybe physical aggression, for instance, then I might lose that level that I had earned previously. That would be a response cost. It is restrictive. It does need to go to HRC. This individual does not want to move to just a point system. He does not want to do it. He wants to keep his levels in, and he wants to keep his bumps in when he gets bumped off a level. And it's hard to argue with the fact that that is his plan and that works for him. So sometimes it would be important to even point that out in the plan, that this is something that he feels safe with and wants to continue with. The Human Rights Committee is required by rule, in case you didn't know. I'm guessing people do. We are, 4 years into this rule being in place now, and it's surprising to me that we're still finding lots of different situations where restrictions are put in place without the team's knowledge. So what do they look like for somebody with Prader-Willi syndrome? Probably a level system. It could be a level system, like I just described. The locking of the food is definitely a restriction because they don't have free access to food. A rigid structure, if it's most people would say that's not the way I live, although I don't need I don't have the same need for sameness and consistency as someone with Prader-Willi syndrome. But that rigid structure, when we look at other citizens out there, we don't normally see that. So, they're likely going to be going to committee anyway. So it would make some sense to list their rigid structure or their structure as part of their restrictions. And then we might have some limits due to obsessive thinking. Lisa told me earlier that I could talk about her puzzles. Lisa loves puzzles. And most of the time you're going to see that most of the people with Prader-Willi syndrome will do some hoarding behaviors. And Lisa has to know how many puzzles she's allowed, because if she didn't have a rule on her puzzles, she would have so many puzzles that you couldn't enter her room. So, and she'll tell you that. So she has a limit on the number of puzzles. And is it important? I mean, the question is out there. Where's your risk of harm for limiting her puzzles? And that's a good question. Committees and teams need to think about what that risk of harm really does look like. And for Lisa, it would be decompensating. It would really affect her emotional health. If she had an unlimitless number of puzzles that she could have, she would not be able to move from activity to activity. She would be very stuck on the puzzle issue. And the hyper-focus is so great there. So that limit really does help with the obsessive thinking, which ties to the obsessive thinking about food, which ties to emotional or her emotional development, as well as their physical statuses. Because we know that when people are stressed, when their emotional development is impacted, that their physical status also gets impacted. So it's important to tie that together if you have limits because of that obsessive thinking. That risk of harm and legal sanction is the biggest piece, and we know that the rule is requiring that. Oftentimes people don't understand why is Prader-Willi syndrome maybe different than some other diagnoses that include appetite control and that kind of thing. And really, the risk of harm is directly related to death for people with Prader-Willi syndrome. And I think we've covered that. Steve covered it nicely. So that is the risk of harm or legal sanction that we're looking at. A well-developed plan that includes necessary restrictions for people with Prader-Willi syndrome is definitely a work in progress. And it's important that people have that they continue to look at new ways, ever so slowly, but new ways that people can thrive. They need the restrictions and the structure to be able to thrive, but when that thriving is no longer happening, then what needs to change so that people can thrive? Because that really can't happen for people. If you have any additional questions or things like that, you have resources available to you through the department. There are local groups that meet that discuss these types of things all the time. You certainly can get some assistance, and I would encourage people to do that.
Thank you, Jean. That was great. And I want to say thank you to Lisa and Grace for sharing their story and being a great advocate for those who are living with Prader-Willi syndrome. And thank you, Steve, for sharing all of your information in regards to the syndrome in of itself. This will conclude the MIID webinar series on Prader-Willi syndrome. Thank you for listening.